Miles Trenholm stood in front of the class with nothing but his accent and the right answer. But when Miss Redmond, the math teacher, burst out laughing mid-sentence, the room followed. That laughter didn't just mock how he spoke. It tried to erase who he was. What no one knew was that the boy they tried to humiliate had already solved a problem the school couldn't. And in 48 hours, the entire country would know his name. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun spilled through the windows of Hawthorne Ridge Middle School, casting long, thin beams across the worn linoleum floors. It was the kind of morning that usually carried a sense of routine. The shuffle of backpacks, the soft scrape of chairs, the muted rhythm of students easing into another day. But for Miles Trenholm, the day already felt heavier than most. The hallways always seemed to press inward around him, as if the walls themselves remembered every time he had been underestimated or mocked. He walked with quiet shoulders, eyes down, moving through a world that often decided who he was before he opened his mouth. In Sin Room 2114, the air was unusually still. The students settled into their seats as Ms. Redmond arranged her stack of worksheets with practiced precision. She was the kind of teacher who believed she understood every student before the year even began. Her expectations were set in stone. Her biases, buried beneath warm smiles, shaped the way she perceived each child the moment they walked in. To her, Miles was the shy black boy, with the drawl that hinted at rural roots. A boy she believed would barely scrape through the semester. A boy she believed she could read like an open book. Miles took his seat near the window, the one place where he could look out and imagine being somewhere else. The faint whisper of wind against the glass grounded him, pulling him through his nerves. He had solved the assigned math problem the night before with a clarity that surprised even himself. Mathematics always felt like a refuge, a space where numbers never judged and patterns never mocked. In math, he wasn't the boy with the accent. He was simply the boy who understood. As class began, Ms. Redmond called for volunteers to share their solutions. Few hands rose. The room was filled with the tension of early adolescence. No one wanted to be wrong, and even fewer wanted to be seen trying. Then she scanned the room and her eyes landed on Miles. He knew what was coming. She often chose him when she needed a moment of amusement, a subtle reminder of who she believed belonged in academic spaces, and who merely occupied them. She called his name, and a ripple of attention passed through the room. Miles stood slowly, grasping the paper that now felt heavier than expected. His heart thudded lightly against his ribs. He cleared his throat, preparing to read. The moment he began speaking, the sound of his voice carried across the room, soft, warm, tilted with the natural rhythm of the South. His accent wrapped around each number and symbol with gentle certainty. For a brief second, the room felt quiet and almost respectful, as if his clarity of thought momentarily overshadowed everything else. Then it happened. A sharp burst of laughter broke through the silence. Not the laughter of surprise or humor shared among friends, but a piercing sound laced with mockery. It came from Ms. Redmond herself. The expression on her face twisted into something between amusement and superiority, the kind of smirk reserved for moments when someone reveals they never took you seriously in the first place. That single laugh had the power to shatter the fragile confidence Miles had built over years of learning to stay quiet. It shot through him like a jolt of cold water. The class reacted instantly. Some students glanced at one another, startled but intrigued. Others let out smaller, echoing chuckles, uncertain but willing to follow the lead of the adult in the room. The humiliation unfolded in slow motion. Miles could feel heat flood his face, a flush of embarrassment and anger he couldn't hide. His hands trembled slightly as he held the paper. The room felt bigger and smaller at the same time, walls stretching outward, while every eye pinned him in place. His voice faltered, not because he didn't know the answer, but because something sharp had pierced the center of his confidence. Ms. Redmond let the moment linger, as if savoring it. Her expression carried the unmistakable tone of someone who believed she was correcting a mistake, reshaping a child in the image she deemed acceptable. She had done it before, quietly and discreetly. But today the mask slipped. Her mockery wasn't hidden behind subtle phrasing. It was open, unrestrained, and cruel. What made it worse was not simply the laughter, but the context behind it. The unspoken suggestion that intelligence in a Southern black boy's voice could not exist in the same sentence. The insinuation that brilliance had a tone, a cadence, a sound that his voice could never match. In that moment, Miles didn't just feel mocked. He felt erased. His classmates looked away, some out of discomfort, others out of fear of being targeted next. A few boys in the back exchanged glances, their smiles widening as they absorbed the permission implicit in the teacher's reaction. If she could laugh at him, so could they. One girl kept her eyes on her desk, guilt flickering across her face, but she said nothing. The silence was another form of harm. Miles stood still, fighting the instinct to shrink into himself. His entire body felt like it was vibrating. He forced himself to keep reading his solution, though each word felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He finished quietly and sat down with a stiffness that hid the turmoil swirling inside him. For the rest of the period he kept his eyes on his notebook, pretending to review notes he could no longer see clearly. Inside him, something was shifting. Beneath the layers of embarrassment, a deeper emotion stirred. Something older than his 13 years. Something shaped by stories his mother told him about her own childhood. About the ways people disguised cruelty as guidance. He had heard his mother speak about teachers who underestimated her, doctors who dismissed her, neighbors who spoke to her as if she were an outsider in the country her ancestors had built. Today he understood those stories with new clarity. He kept replaying the moment in his mind. The sound of Miss Redmond's laugh wasn't loud, but it was cutting sharp enough that he knew he would remember it for years. It was the kind of moment that carved a mark into a person's identity, shaping how they saw themselves. She had mocked his accent, but what she was truly mocking was everything he represented: his family, his background, his cultural roots, his place in that classroom. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Miles's brilliance extended far beyond the curriculum she barely understood. At home, he spent hours solving logic puzzles, exploring online math forums, studying concepts 2 or 3 grade levels above his own. Numbers came to him with a natural ease. Patterns unfolded in his mind like stories. He saw equations the way artists saw colors, the way musicians heard melodies. But genius meant little when filtered through the lens of someone unwilling to see it. As the bell finally rang, the class sprang to life with the relief of escape. Chairs scraped back, conversations resumed, and laughter, real this time, filled the room again. But Miles stayed seated for a moment longer, gathering himself. His hands were still trembling, but his jaw had set into a quiet resolve he didn't fully understand yet. When he finally stood to leave, he moved with a different posture, not stronger, not yet, but more aware. The experience had left a mark, but rather than crush him, it was already beginning to form something new inside him, something sharper than humiliation and deeper than anger. He walked out of room 217, knowing something had shifted. The world around him didn't look different, but he felt different moving through it. He knew the laughter would follow him through the halls, echoing in whispers and passing glances. He knew the story would travel. He knew the weight of what had just happened would not simply fade. What he didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that the moment designed to belittle him would soon ignite the first spark of a much larger fire. What Miss Redmond failed to realize was that Miles wasn't simply a quiet boy with a soft voice. He was a hidden prodigy, and her cruelty had just awakened the part of him he had kept in the shadows. The walk home from school felt longer than usual. Miles moved through his neighborhood with his backpack hanging lower than usual, as if the weight of the day had added bricks to the bottom. Autumn leaves scattered across cracked sidewalks, kicked aside by shoes worn down from growing faster than his mother could afford to replace them. His head was slightly bowed, not in shame, but in calculation. The laughter still echoed, but beneath it, something else was rising. Inside their 2-bedroom apartment, the curtains were drawn halfway, letting in a warm slice of sunlight that cut across the living room floor. Keandra Trinholm's nurse uniform hung on the back of a kitchen chair, soaked with the stress of another overnight shift. Miles barely glanced at it. He dropped his backpack silently near the door and went straight to the desk in the corner of the room, the one his mother had rescued from the curb 3 months earlier. Scratched and slanted, but he opened a fresh notebook, the kind he usually saved for math notes or brain teasers. But this time, he dated the first page and wrote a single word in bold: bias. What followed was a quiet storm of memory and realization. He listed every time a teacher corrected his pronunciation when he answered correctly. He documented how often he was called on compared to white students. He noted the body language, the slight eyebrow raise when he used advanced vocabulary, the long pauses before someone acknowledged he was right. He remembered the way certain classmates were praised for being articulate or well-spoken, while he was told to slow down or use proper grammar. What they heard as uneducated, he knew as the music of generations, the echo of Southern black identity wrapped around words. For months, he had suspected what now felt undeniable. The school didn't see him. Not really. They saw a version of him, filtered through decades of cultural assumptions. When he raised his hand, they didn't see capability. They saw risk. When he answered questions quickly, they looked for mistakes. When he solved equations differently, they called it unorthodox, not innovative. His intelligence wasn't the kind they expected, so they ignored it altogether. But Miles wasn't average. He wasn't even ordinary by gifted standards. He had an unusual ability to visualize complex patterns, to intuit solutions, before most students could even understand the problem. Numbers moved for him, not just as symbols but as shapes, colors, pulses. He saw symmetry in street grids, coded patterns in nature, and fractals in sidewalk cracks. Yet the institution built around him had spent years treating him like a background character in someone else's story. And he had let them. He had stayed quiet to avoid drawing attention. He had laughed off insults, convinced himself it was easier to blend in than stand out. But after that moment in room 2014, after Ms. Redmond laughed and made his accent the punchline, something shifted. The old silence no longer protected him. It only allowed others to feel comfortable. At school, the days that followed carried an uneasy rhythm. Nothing overt changed. Miss Redmond taught as usual, as if nothing had happened. She avoided Miles's gaze, but her tone stayed light, performative. If anything, she became more cheerful with the class, as though overcompensating for something she wouldn't acknowledge. Her smile now felt like a mask, worn too tight. Other teachers mirrored the same behavior. Miles began noticing how they spoke differently around white students. Voices softened, praise abundant, around him, and other black students. Their tone became more instructional, clipped. It wasn't what they said, it was how they said it. And once Miles started paying attention, he couldn't stop seeing it. He filled page after page of the notebook. He started using codes and symbols to track patterns in classroom behavior. He kept tallies of interruptions, praise, participation. Even in other subjects, he saw it. When a black girl in science class asked a question, she was told to wait. When a white boy repeated the same question minutes later, the teacher lit up, called it insightful, and wrote it on the board. The disparities weren't imagined, they were systematic. But Miles didn't just observe. He began feeding his frustration into self-study. Every insult, every smirk, every eye roll became fuel. He started waking up earlier to study before school. He solved advanced math problems in his notebook, using YouTube tutorials and forums meant for high schoolers and college students. When the world dismissed him, he retreated into numbers, the one language that didn't betray him. Still, even in his private triumphs, there was loneliness. He couldn't talk to his classmates about it. Most had accepted the way things were. He didn't want to burden his mother, who already carried too much. So he said nothing. But in silence, his strength grew. The unexpected twist came one Thursday morning. Just as Miles was finishing his notes in homeroom, a substitute teacher took roll call. Ms. Redmond was out. No explanation. A quiet buzz spread across the room. The absence wasn't just felt, it was noticed. Later that day, he overheard something while walking past the teacher's lounge. Miss Redmond had been spoken to by administration. Not punished, not reprimanded, but spoken to. Miles didn't know what that meant exactly, but he felt a shift, not relief, not justice, just movement. That evening, he added a new section to the notebook. Institutional response. He wrote down every vague excuse the school had ever used to justify unequal treatment. We're doing our best. It wasn't intentional. It's just a misunderstanding. The notebook became his mirror, his evidence, his armor. By the end of the week, the notebook had grown thick. Every entry a truth he could no longer unsee. He wasn't trying to build a case. He wasn't planning a rebellion. He was simply trying to understand why a place designed to nurture minds had spent so much energy minimizing his. Then, one afternoon, as he sat under the bleachers during recess, his quiet sanctuary, he noticed a shadow fall across the pages. He looked up, expecting a classmate, but instead, it was Ms. Dunley, the school's counselor. Her face unreadable, her voice unusually soft. She said she had heard he was keeping notes. Miles tensed. His first thought was trouble. He nodded cautiously. Miss Dunley knelt beside him, glanced at the notebook, and after a moment's pause, she said something unexpected. She wanted to read it. It was the first time an adult in that building asked to see him, not control him, not correct him, but truly see him. And yet, even as she turned the pages, something in her expression hardened. The next day, Miles is called to the office, but the person waiting for him isn't Ms. Dunley. It's someone from the district office, holding a copy of his notebook. The next morning, the weight in Miles's chest hadn't lifted. He moved through the halls like a figure inside a glass box, visible, yet untouched. People looked at him differently now, some with curiosity, others with avoidance. His silence had become louder than any outburst, and the notebook, that was no longer just his. Ms. Dunley had read it, and now, someone from the district held a copy. But something else was spreading too. Whispers. First, it was Lariah, a soft-spoken 8th grader who barely spoke to anyone unless pressed. She approached Miles quietly during lunch, her eyes shifting from side to side. She sat down at his table without invitation, fingers twitching nervously around a plastic spoon. She leaned in and confessed almost apologetically that Miss Redmond had once told her she'd never make it in STEM if she didn't straighten out that ghetto slang. That had been back in 6th grade. She never told anyone because she thought it was her fault. Then there was Nolan, a tall, lanky boy who was always in the back row, always nodding off, always in trouble for something. He told Miles about how, last semester, Ms. Redmond asked him to calm down the theatrics when he read aloud. He hadn't been theatrical, he had just read with passion, something he learned from his church. But she'd mimicked his voice in front of everyone and said she didn't speak preacher. These weren't isolated incidents. They weren't misunderstandings. They were consistent. What shook Miles wasn't just the stories. It was how quickly they emerged once he started listening. Each one laced with the same tone. Jokes passed off as discipline, insults dressed in sarcasm. The common thread wasn't just Redmond, though she was often at the center. It was the culture around her. A culture that allowed teachers to weaponize humor against black students with complete immunity. It wasn't only about what was said, but who was allowed to say it, and who wasn't allowed to object. When Miles compared notes, the pattern snapped into focus. Feedback for white students was academic. For black students, it was personal. White boys were expressive. Black boys were disruptive. White girls were outspoken. Black girls were aggressive. It wasn't just grading that was unequal. It was the very language of authority. The school didn't punish students like Miles by lowering their grades or handing out detentions. It punished them by slowly eroding their self-worth. A laugh here, a mocking imitation there. The suggestion that their voices didn't belong. It was death by 1,000 chuckles. None of them harmless. Worse, these microaggressions were normalized. Hidden behind smiles, excused as miscommunication. They were built into the lesson plans, into the hallway jokes, into staff room conversations about which kids were gifted and which were lost causes. Racism wasn't the monster in the room. It was the wallpaper. For Miles, each story added a new layer of clarity, and another page in the notebook. Then came the twist no one expected. A student, no one knew who, had filmed the incident with Miss Redmond. The laugh, the smirk, the way her lips curled when she repeated Miles's answer in an exaggerated southern drawl. It was all there. 12 seconds. Unedited. Unmistakable. It began circulating quietly through AirDrop. Then group chats. Then Instagram stories. Within hours, students across grade levels had seen it. Some laughed, thinking it was funny. Others froze, knowing what they had just witnessed wasn't a joke. It was evident. Someone, anonymous and likely a student, uploaded the video to Twitter late that night, with a caption that read, "This how our teachers talk to black kids." Still think it's just a joke? It didn't go viral instantly, but it didn't stay hidden either. The next morning, phones buzzed with the force of incoming reckoning. Screens lit up with the familiar thumbnail. Miss Redmond's face, mid-sentence caught in a half-smile that now looked sinister. The laughter in the background sounded uglier once detached from the moment. It didn't sound funny anymore. It sounded cruel. Miles saw it while brushing his teeth. The video had been reposted by a regional education equity account, then by a local journalist, then by a national one. The caption changed with each repost, but the message stayed the same. This wasn't an isolated moment. It was a system caught slipping. By second period, the principal was in damage control. Students were told to stay off their phones. Teachers were instructed not to comment, but the silence only made the noise louder. Miles kept his eyes down, but he felt it in the way people stared, not at him directly, but around him, like he was the center of a storm no one wanted to name. His body felt both invisible and hypervisible. He hadn't posted the video. He hadn't even known it existed, but in everyone's eyes, he was the reason it mattered. What none of them knew, what not even Miles expected, was how quickly the story would spiral into something no school policy could contain. A local news crew parks outside the school gates, and before lunch, Miles's face is on their homepage. Without his permission, by mid-morning, Hawthorne Ridge Middle School was no longer just a quiet corner of Georgia. It was trending. The 12-second clip, once an anonymous whisper among classmates, had ignited a wildfire. It started small, reposted by regional education accounts, and followed by a few Black parent coalitions. But within hours, it exploded into something far bigger. Black Twitter, always quick to amplify injustice, carried the video like a torch. Hashtags appeared almost instantly. Accent is not ignorance. Miles was right. Teach the teacher. The internet didn't just react. It roared. Teachers, activists, and celebrities weighed in. One thread broke down the audio tone, in Miss Redmond's voice. Another overlaid the incident with historical commentary on linguistic racism and the demonization of Black Southern speech. And the comments, they came in floods. Some spoke of personal pain, others raw outrage, but none of it was performative. Every post added weight to something that could no longer be dismissed. Back at school, Principal Lovett stood stiffly in his office, tie loosened, scrolling his phone with trembling fingers. His inbox was bursting, news agencies, legal departments, and furious parents demanding answers. But there were no real answers to give, because for all their policies, for all their mission statements about equity and excellence, they had never anticipated being exposed. They weren't prepared for the truth to go public. In the front office, Ms. Redmond was nowhere to be found. She had left just before first bell under the excuse of medical leave. But the damage was already done. Students whispered in hallways. Teachers exchanged nervous glances. Some tried to keep their routines intact, clinging to lesson plans as shields. But it was useless. The building had cracked. What disturbed the administration most wasn't the fact that the video had gone viral. It was that it couldn't be controlled. The clip was short, undeniable, and perfectly damning. No context could soften it. No press release could spin it. The image of a white teacher mocking a Black student's voice, while students laughed in the background, was too clear. Miles sat in third period, hands folded, face forward. He hadn't spoken a word since arriving at school. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. Some students avoided looking at him. Others looked too long. The air buzzed with discomfort, not sympathy. He felt like a spectacle, not for what he had done, but for what had been done to him. His phone vibrated nonstop in his pocket. Mentions, reposts, DM requests. But he didn't check. He already understood what had happened. The moment wasn't his anymore. It had become a symbol, a mirror reflecting something much larger than one laugh in one classroom. By fourth period, it was no longer just online. A local news van pulled up outside the school gates, its antenna rising like a flag. Then came another. A camera crew tried to enter the main office. When they were blocked, they interviewed students outside, catching sound bites from nervous 8th graders, and one overly eager PTA mom. The footage was rushed into a breaking news slot by 12. That's when the real shift happened. Not in hearts, in strategy. The school district's PR team jumped into action. They released a brief statement claiming the district takes concerns of equity and student dignity seriously, and was currently investigating the situation. It was the kind of wording designed to say everything and nothing. It didn't name Miles. It didn't name Ms. Redmond. It didn't even mention racism. Parents, however, had no interest in waiting for policy to catch up. A group of Black mothers met in the parking lot that afternoon, holding handmade signs. One read, "His accent is our history." Another, "We are not your punchlines." They stood quietly but firmly at the curb, facing the cameras, letting their presence speak louder than their words. Inside the school, the tone soured fast. Miles's teachers became stiffer, colder. No one said it outright, but the mood shifted. He could feel it in the pauses when he raised his hand, in the forced neutrality of their expressions, in the silence when he passed them in the halls. The boy who was once overlooked was now a liability. Miles didn't want attention. He had never sought it. But now, no matter where he turned, he felt like a walking headline. Some students whispered that he'd snitched on the school. Others said he was lucky to be famous. A few tried to be friendly, but it felt rehearsed, like actors reading lines for a part they didn't audition for. Then, just before the last bell, a soft chime rang through the PA system, one that signaled an all-staff email had been sent. In classrooms, teachers checked their screens and froze. The subject line was simple: campus-wide engagement opportunity, Math Genius Challenge launching tomorrow. It was a Hail Mary attempt by the administration to redirect attention. Buried in the email was an announcement for a sudden school-wide competition, framed as a celebration of academic excellence and student voice. The wording was strategic. It praised students for stepping into the spotlight and emphasized positive narratives. Not once did it mention racism, or the viral video, or the reason everyone was suddenly so interested in math scores. But Miles saw it for what it was: a distraction. They weren't solving the problem. They were branding it. And just like that, without permission or consultation, the school had turned its biggest wound into a PR campaign. They tried to bury the moment by elevating a competition, hoping the noise of progress would drown out the sound of truth. But what they didn't expect was that the very boy they tried to silence, the one they never saw coming, was about to step forward again. Miles signs up for the Math Genius Challenge, and when the sign-up sheet returns to the office, his name is at the very top. The announcement of the Math Genius Challenge didn't erase the tension in the halls. If anything, it sharpened it. Students whispered more. Teachers walked faster, and the air carried a strange static, like the building itself knew something had ruptured beneath the surface. Miles felt every shift, every glance, every forced smile that cracked like thin ice. His name written at the top of the sign-up sheet wasn't just bold ink on paper. It was a quiet rebellion. A decision that unsettled the adults far more than the video ever had. When Principal Lovett called Miles and his mother into his office the next morning, the room looked staged. The blinds were half open to let in a soft glow. A tray of untouched cookies sat on the corner table, next to a pitcher of water that had already begun to sweat. Principal Lovett's suit jacket hung neatly on a hook, as if he had removed it only to appear more approachable. His smile was wide, practiced, almost theatrical. His tone had the skimming politeness of someone reading lines from a script. He apologized for the miscommunication that had taken place. He expressed regret that Miles felt uncomfortable in class. He assured them that the school valued every student's voice, but beneath every phrase was a hollow ring, a rehearsed emptiness that made each sentence feel like a thin layer of paint over a much deeper crack. His words avoided the heart of the incident. He never named racism. He never acknowledged bias. He never said Redmond had done anything wrong, and that was intentional. Keandra sat rigid in her chair, her jaw tight, eyes narrowed. She had seen smiles like this before in hospital boardrooms. Smiles meant to pacify families without addressing the root of their grievances. She recognized the performance, and she knew when someone was hiding behind a facade to protect themselves, rather than the people harmed. Miles watched the exchange from his seat, taking in every controlled gesture, every sidestep. The apology wasn't for him, it was for optics. The principal assured them that appropriate measures had been taken. But when pressed gently firmly, he skirted specifics. He mentioned professional conversations, peer evaluations, and growth opportunities. Not once did he say suspension. Not once did he say evaluation by a third party. Not once did he say accountability. By the end of the meeting, nothing had changed. What lingered in the air as they left wasn't closure. It was confirmation. The school wasn't protecting Miles. It was protecting itself. As Miles walked through the halls afterward, he felt a shift he couldn't name yet. Students who had once ignored him now watched him with open curiosity, some with sympathy, others with annoyance, a few with quiet irritation, as if he had disrupted the invisible hierarchy they depended on. He realized then that the school didn't need him to misbehave to deem him a threat. His existence in the spotlight was enough. The faculty room became its own battleground. Teachers whispered behind closed doors, their tones sharp and clipped. Some defended Miles quietly, though never loudly enough for anyone to hear their names attached to support. Others expressed irritation. They claimed the situation was blown out of proportion. They insisted the video captured an exaggerated moment. They whispered that kids these days were too sensitive, that parents were too reactive, that Black Twitter was too aggressive. And then there were the ones who looked at Miles and saw not a student, but a risk. They began referring to him as the disruption. Not openly, not in emails, but in murmured conversations that floated through hallways, passed between rooms, and seeped into the air like a quiet toxin. They said his presence made things more complicated. They said the school didn't need outside scrutiny. They said he was drawing unnecessary attention. The language was coded. The meaning was not. Miles felt it most sharply in class. Teachers who once ignored him now handled him like glass, brittle, dangerous, but easily cracked. Their politeness had an edge to it, a veneer of distance that said they were protecting themselves, not him. When he raised his hand, they took longer to call on him, as if weighing the risk of letting him speak. When he completed assignments early, they offered no praise, just tight-lipped nods. Doing too well was just as threatening as speaking out. He noticed a change in Miss Becker, his English teacher. She usually spoke with warm, flowing enthusiasm, but now her sentences were clipped around him, measured in a way that revealed more fear than professionalism. She didn't correct him. She didn't challenge him. She simply avoided him, and avoidance, Miles realized, could be its own kind of harm, the kind that slowly erases a person by acting as if they don't exist. In history class, Mr. Harmon glanced at him too often, eyes flickering with unease. He made subtle shifts in discussion topics. If he sensed Miles might have strong opinions, he reshaped lessons mid-sentence, to avoid anything that could ignite controversy. His discomfort seeped into the room, leaving Miles feeling not seen, but watched. Each day chipped away at the illusion that the administration cared. Each gesture revealed another crack in the school's carefully crafted identity. They didn't want justice. They wanted quiet, but the quiet was gone. Outside, the video continued to spread. A major news page reposted it. A well-known civil rights educator shared commentary. A national podcast mentioned the incident in a broader discussion about linguistic racism in schools. What had begun as a 12-second recording had become a mirror held up to an entire institution. And institutions feared mirror. Late in the afternoon, just as the final bell rang, Miles returned to his locker to collect his things. The hallway was nearly empty. The hum of conversation faded as students drifted toward buses and cars. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, their flicker casting thin shadows over the tile. He was closing his locker when he sensed someone behind him. It was Mr. Grayson, a science teacher he barely interacted with. He was usually cheerful, always greeting students with a booming voice that bounced off the walls. But now his face held none of that warmth. His eyes darted down the hallway before settling on Miles. He spoke softly, almost whispering, as if afraid of being heard. His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried a weight Miles instantly recognized. He said he had been at the staff meeting earlier. He said the situation had ruffled feathers in ways Miles couldn't imagine. He said some teachers were blaming him, not the system. He said the tension was going to get worse, before it got better. Then his voice dropped lower still, filled with a discomfort that bordered on guilt. He told Miles he might want to consider transferring schools for his own good. The words sank into Miles' chest like a stone, not because they were cruel, because they were a warning. And warnings only came when storms were already forming. As Miles processes the suggestion, he finds a folded note slipped inside his locker, with his name written on the front in handwriting he doesn't recognize. The announcement posters went up overnight. Bright, glossy prints lined the main hallway before the first bell rang. Red and gold letters beamed across thick paper. Hawthorne Ridge presents Math Genius Challenge, a celebration of excellence. Below the headline, cartoonish graphics of calculators and smiling students floated beside slogans like "Brilliance has no boundaries" and "Every voice counts." It was too polished, too colorful, too fast. Students exchanged looks the moment they saw the posters. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood what this really was. A distraction. A shield. A glossy bandage over a festering wound. The school didn't want to clean. In place of accountability, they gave the illusion of opportunity. For the administration, the competition was perfect. It hit all the right notes: academic excellence, student participation, diversity talking points. It was packaged as progress, a way to move forward without ever confronting what had happened. It allowed them to pretend the past few days had been a misunderstanding, rather than a systemic revelation. The rules were simple. Any student could enter. The rounds would span 2 weeks, ending in a final face-off in the auditorium, streamed to classrooms, covered by local media, judged by a panel of math teachers from neighboring schools. Prizes included gift cards, certificates, and a personalized commendation from the superintendent. The word inclusion appeared 6 times in the memo, and yet beneath the surface it reeked of erasure. Miles stood in front of the poster at lunch, flanked by a crowd of murmuring students. No one expected him to participate. If anything, they expected him to reject it, to stay above the stunt. His silence had already made him a symbol. His dignity, unshaken in the face of mockery, had carried more weight than any press release. But symbols didn't change systems. He moved without speaking, walked straight into the main office, and picked up the sign-up sheet clipped to a clipboard on the secretary's desk. For a moment the room held its breath. Students nearby watched through the glass window, pausing mid-conversation. The office assistant shifted uneasily in her chair. A counselor pretended to rearrange papers. Every movement felt choreographed, like a scene in a play that had taken an unscripted turn. Miles wrote his name in clean, deliberate letters at the top of the list. The pen hovered for a second after he finished, not in hesitation but in defiance. He wanted it clear. There would be no hiding behind silence anymore. As he turned to leave, his eyes drifted across the names already on the sheet. There it was. Trevor Callan, Derek Feld, Brianna Reed, the 3 loudest laughs from the day of the incident. The ones who had doubled over when Miss Redmond mocked his voice. The ones who had mimicked him in the hallways for weeks afterward. Their names weren't just on the list. They were signed near the top in thick, confident strokes. It wasn't a coincidence. They hadn't suddenly discovered a love for equations. They had signed up because they saw the competition for what it was, a chance to reclaim the spotlight, to rewrite their roles in the story. The school had framed the challenge as unity, but for them it was strategy. They didn't care about math. They cared about visibility. For Miles, the realization wasn't painful. It was clarifying. He had been playing defense since the moment Miss Redmond laughed. Staying quiet, enduring whispers, watching his name become a headline. But this was different. This was a field he understood. Math wasn't subjective. Math didn't lie. And if they wanted to turn the challenge into theater, then he would turn it into truth. That night, at home, Keandra found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by scratch paper and open tabs on the family's old laptop. Equations, logic puzzles, complex proofs filled every surface. His brows were tight, his movements sharp. She didn't interrupt. She simply watched, seeing for the first time the focus that had been simmering quietly for years now boiling to the surface. He studied through dinner, through the news cycle, through the growing noise outside their apartment, where neighbors debated whether he was brave or foolish. He barely flinched when another journalist emailed Keandra asking for an interview. His mind was elsewhere. He wasn't trying to prove them wrong anymore. He was building something no one could ignore. At school, tension built like static electricity. Teachers tried to act neutral, but neutrality had already failed. Some smiled tightly when they passed him in the hallway, their eyes flicking to his backpack like it contained something volatile. Others avoided him entirely. But the students watched everything. Every move, every page he flipped, every nod he gave when an answer clicked into place. Whispers started again, but this time, they weren't about the video. They were about the kid who was about to compete. The kid who spoke less and solved more. The one who didn't clap back or retaliate, or post rage-fueled rants. The one who simply walked into a room, opened a notebook, and let numbers speak for him. Even the other contestants noticed. Trevor began hanging around the library more. Brianna asked one of the tutors for help with factoring. Derek started bringing a calculator to lunch. It wasn't fear. It was preparation. They sensed something unspoken. Miles wasn't participating to win a prize. He was participating to reveal something. And they didn't know what. 2 days before the competition began, a revised schedule went out. The event had been upgraded. Now it was being featured on the district website. A photographer would be covering the final round. The auditorium would be open to families. A special guest judge was rumored to be attending, a district board member known for advocating academic reform. The stakes had changed, but the motive hadn't. What the administration still failed to understand was that by trying to use Miles as an example, they had given him a platform, and by pretending to support him without addressing what had happened, they had turned a child's pain into a parade float. Now he was done waiting to be handed dignity. He was about to take it. On the morning of the first challenge, Miles finds a sticky note on his locker, a math riddle written in red ink, and signed Redmond. The sticky note stayed in Miles' pocket all day. Red ink. Thin handwriting. One single math riddle, deceptively simple on the surface, but wrapped in layered traps that only someone trained in logic would detect. Beneath it just one signature, Redmond. No first name, no explanation, no threat, but the meaning was clear. She was watching. The note didn't scare Miles. It didn't rattle his resolve. It sharpened it. That night the apartment was quiet, but alive with intention. Keandra sat at the kitchen table, hands trembling slightly, as she sorted through overdue bills beneath a flickering overhead light. Across the room, Miles had created a makeshift war room. Textbooks borrowed from the library stacked 2 feet high. Scratch paper blanketed the floor in formulas and symbols. The laptop, old, slow but functional, hummed under the strain of multiple tabs open at once. Advanced algebra threads, coding challenge forums, archived competition problems, and international math Olympiad solutions. He wasn't cramming. He was evolving. This wasn't about a school competition anymore. It was a proving ground. And he was building a weapon no one could see. Not in his fists, not in his voice, but in his mind. Miles had learned early on that visibility didn't always equal safety. But invisibility? That was control. In the shadows, he could operate without judgment. In silence, he could grow without resistance. Each night, as the city settled into sleep, he pushed himself further. He memorized patterns, rewrote entire solution pathways, trained himself to work through stress, fatigue, distraction. He learned the math behind encryption, probability paradoxes, non-linear equations, the kind of material that bent even high school students backward. And still he kept going. By midnight his fingers ached from gripping a pencil too tightly. But he didn't stop. Sometimes, he caught his mother watching him from across the room. Her eyes softened with pride, but tightened around the edges with worry. She didn't interrupt. She never asked him to slow down. But he noticed when she quietly sold her necklace, the silver one from her graduation, and came home with the battered laptop he now used. He noticed when meals got smaller and grocery bags lighter. He noticed when she wore the same shoes every day, even when the sole began peeling at the edges. And he noticed the envelope tucked behind the calendar on the wall. He never asked, but he saw her glance at it every morning, saw the way her hand hovered, just long enough to betray the truth. She was hiding something. The nights got longer. Miles' schedule grew tighter. He set alarms for study sprints, built mock competitions, timed himself, graded himself harsher than any teacher ever had. His own standards became a fortress. Each success gave him confidence. Each mistake, fuel. Outside, the school still buzzed with speculation. Some students whispered that he was obsessed. Others said he was lucky. A few tried to mimic his movements, suddenly appearing in the library more often. But none stayed long. They didn't understand that Miles wasn't preparing for a test. He was preparing for a reckoning. The challenge became more than numbers. It became about resistance. Every equation he solved was a refusal to be erased. Every strategy he learned was armor. In class, he remained quiet, not withdrawn, but observant. He watched how teachers glanced over him, how Trevor made passive-aggressive jokes about overachievers, how Brianna rolled her eyes when the rules of the competition were posted in the hallway. He took it all in, without reaction. His silence had never been weakness. It was calculation. Back at home, his world shrank to survival and strategy. Keandra's shifts grew longer. He noticed her shoes leave earlier and return later. The kitchen light stayed on, long past midnight, and the envelopes behind the calendar became a small, growing stack. Then came the twist. 3 nights before the first round of the challenge, Miles went to get a pencil from the kitchen drawer. The calendar above it was slightly tilted. When he adjusted it, an envelope slipped from behind and fell to the floor, face down. He didn't mean to look, but he did. On the back, in bold black letters, "Final eviction warning. Notice to vacate within 72 hours. He stood frozen. Everything around him fell quiet. The hum of the laptop, the shuffle of paper, even the ticking wall clock. The note in his pocket suddenly felt heavier. His mom had never said a word. She had been holding up their entire life on crumbling ground. While he studied equations, she had been negotiating with landlords, skipping meals, cutting back on every comfort to keep their home standing. And still, she smiled every morning. Still, she told him she was proud. Still, she encouraged him to compete. Miles folded the letter back into its envelope and slipped it behind the calendar again. He didn't say anything. He just returned to his notes, but his hands were shaking. This wasn't just about math. This was about legacy. He wasn't only competing for himself now. He was trying to solve the one problem no one else would touch, the one that connected his home, his school, and the system that tried to flatten him into statistics. The morning of the first competition round, Miles walks into school and finds a flyer taped to his locker that reads, "You can't solve everything." The flyer stayed on Miles's locker for nearly an hour before a janitor tore it down. It was printed, not handwritten, clean font, bold letters. "You can't solve everything." No name, no logo, no signature. It wasn't a taunt. It was a warning. Miles stood in front of it for longer than he should have. The hallway moved around him, a stream of students, laughter, sneakers, and gossip. Some glanced at the sign, smirked, and kept walking. Others looked away, embarrassed by its presence. No one said anything, but everyone saw it. That was the story of his life. Everyone saw, but no one spoke. The community surrounding Hawthorne Ridge had always prided itself on being safe. It was the kind of town where diversity was something printed on pamphlets, not practiced, where neighbors smiled across fences but locked their doors at night when unfamiliar footsteps passed. It was a place filled with yard signs that read "Hate has no home here," while school board meetings danced around words like equity and race, like they were explosives. For years, the adults had watched the patterns unfold at the school. Black students tracked into remedial classes despite test scores. White students favored for leadership roles. Discipline distributed unevenly. Teachers praised for classroom control when their control only targeted certain voices. These weren't secrets. They were daily realities. Quietly endured, never addressed. But the video changed everything. When Miss Redmond laughed, the world saw what the community had chosen to ignore for too long. It wasn't just about a teacher's mockery. It was about a culture that allowed it, enabled it, smiled through it. And when Miles chose to compete, not protest, not shout, not threaten, but simply enter a math competition with quiet confidence, he flipped the equation on all of them. He became a mirror. And mirrors are dangerous in rooms filled with denial. Parents began to pick sides, not openly at first, but in subtle ways. Conversations shifted at grocery stores. PTA group chats buzzed with tension. Some parents praised Miles as brave and gifted, but their tone carried distance, as if admiring a figure from history, not a child who walked their school's halls. Others called the situation exhausting. A few muttered that the school had been too generous in letting him remain. Teachers, too, split down in visible lines. A few defended Miles behind closed doors, risking quiet scorn from colleagues. Others hardened their positions, insisting he was being manipulated by activists. They resented that his story had become public, that their reputations were now entangled in something they didn't control. Neighbors who once waved at Keandra from across the courtyard now avoided eye contact. Some stopped inviting her to community events. A few sent messages masked as concern, asking if she was sure this was good for Miles's mental health, if she'd thought about the long-term consequences. But Miles noticed the most subtle shift at church. The small local congregation, once a source of comfort, now offered polite silence instead of prayers. Eyes drifted when his family entered. Pews shifted. He heard his name during side conversations, in the parking lot. People who had watched him grow up now spoke of him like he had outgrown his place. He was no longer the quiet kid with the accent. He was the boy who dared to challenge the system they depended on. And yet, Miles kept studying, kept showing up, kept solving problems, not just on paper, but in the hearts of those who feared what his presence meant. He wasn't trying to lead, but leadership had found him. He didn't wear it like a badge. He wore it like armor. Then, just days before the second round of the competition, the school board received an anonymous letter, typed, double-spaced, delivered in a plain envelope with no return address. The contents were leaked by a staff assistant to a local parent, who shared it with a friend, who sent it to Keandra in a trembling direct message. The letter warned the school board that Miles was being used as a political pawn. It accused outside groups of exploiting a minor for social justice agendas. It questioned whether the video had been doctored. It implied Keandra was encouraging victimhood. It asked if the board had considered the message this sends to our high-performing students who earned their place without controversy. It didn't name race. It didn't have to. The letter was a mirror of the fear that had always lived beneath the surface. the fear of a black child rising without permission, without apology. Keandra read it 3 times, then folded it slowly and placed it next to the eviction notice behind the calendar. She didn't show it to Miles, but he felt its weight the next morning when she hugged him longer than usual. When her eyes lingered on his as he grabbed his backpack. When she whispered nothing at all. The community had drawn its line.
Not with violence.
With silence, judgment, and strategic doubt, Miles returns to school to find his math competition profile removed from the official hallway display, replaced with Trevor's photo instead. Miles had learned to expect resistance, but not erasure. On Monday morning, he arrived 15 minutes early, same as always. The second round of the Math Genius Challenge was only days away, and he wanted a quiet start. The school halls, still half-lit, were a rare moment of peace. The buzz of fluorescent lights, the shuffle of janitor carts, it all formed a rhythm he could think within. But as he turned the corner near the main stairwell, something felt off. The wall near the trophy case had been updated overnight. A bulletin board titled "Spotlight on Scholars" had been dressed with glossy new photos. The Math Challenge contestants, headshots, bios, inspirational quotes. But his wasn't there. Trevor's photo, enlarged and centered, dominated the display. Under it the words, "One to watch, natural leadership, academic excellence." Miles searched the rest of the board. Derek, Brianna, even a student who had already been eliminated in the qualifiers. But nowhere, not even in a corner, was his name. Not a quote, not a mention, nothing. The air around him felt suddenly colder. He didn't say anything. He didn't pull out his phone. He just stood there and let the moment press into him, harder than any insult. This wasn't an accident. This was curated exclusion. A decision made in a staff room where someone thought it better to celebrate anyone else but him. He knew what they were doing. Reward obedience, elevate comfort, ignore confrontation. And still he walked away. He didn't confront the office. He didn't ask why. He went to his locker, only to find the second blow. His locker door, once bare, was now streaked with permanent marker. Thick, black letters across the metal read, "You're not the face we want." The message was unsigned, crude, and left deliberately visible. Not inside the locker, not hidden in a note, but smeared boldly across the outside for every student walking past to see. The words hit with surgical precision. Not about grades, not about behavior, about representation. It wasn't just an attack on Miles. It was a warning to anyone who looked like him, talked like him, or dared to challenge the hierarchy built into those walls. He stood still for a moment, eyes steady, face blank. A few students walked past. One let out a soft whistle. Another laughed under their breath. No one stopped. No one offered to help. No teacher came by. The bell rang. The message remained. Miles cleaned it off himself. He tore a few sheets from his notebook, dampened them under the faucet in the boys' bathroom, and scrubbed until the ink faded into a dull shadow. Then he went to class. But the attacks didn't stop. That afternoon he returned to his locker to find his practice sheets missing. Pages of solved equations, hours of annotated notes, gone. In their place, a single page, blank except for a smiley face drawn in the corner. He reported it. The front office filed a general incident report. No follow-up, no investigation, no camera review, just another line on another form destined to be filed and forgotten. He tried to replace the work. Stayed up later. Redid his practice. But fatigue clung to him like fog. His answers came slower. His focus flickered. His heart beat harder at every whisper behind him. Even his hands, once steady as steel, began to tremble. Teachers noticed. They had to. But nothing changed. Miss Becker in English class, who once praised his analytical essays, now highlighted Trevor's responses instead. Mr. Harmon called on Derek twice during math warm-ups. Never on Miles. In the staff room, his name became shorthand for disruption again, not for behavior, for present, for existing in defiance of what the school preferred to see on camera. And the worst part? It worked. Not on Miles, but on the other students. Some started keeping their distance. A few who once asked for help with homework stopped talking to him. Even Lariah, who once sat beside him during lunch, began sitting at the far end of the table. They weren't angry. They were afraid. They knew what happened to the ones who stood too close to fire. But Miles kept moving, kept solving, kept showing up, because even in their silence, he knew one thing. His answers couldn't be erased. Still, the school made sure to remind him how small he was supposed to feel. 3 days before the semifinal round, He returned from PE to find his math notebook moved. It wasn't stolen. It was sitting neatly back on his desk. But when he opened it, a new page had been slipped between his notes. The handwriting wasn't jagged or rushed. It was careful, deliberate, written in blue ink, centered on the page. Your kind don't win here. 7 words. No signature. No explanation. Just a sentence that held every ounce of the school's unspoken rules. He read it twice. Then he turned the page and kept working. That night, Miles opens his bedroom window for air and sees a small envelope tucked into the edge of the fire escape, addressed to him, with the school's return address. Keandra Trenholm hadn't cried in front of Miles since he was 5. She believed in strength, the kind that had to be worn like a uniform, stitched tight across long shifts, past due bills and daily indignities. For 13 years, she had carried everything on her back, her child, their history, their hope, and now as she sat behind the wheel of her car in the hospital parking lot, she finally cracked. The email had come during her lunch break. It was from her supervisor, sterile in tone, clinical in cruelty. Due to ongoing media disruption and unauthorized press inquiries, her hours would be reduced effective immediately. Not terminated, not punished, just slowly pushed out. There had been no warning. No one asked if the news vans outside her complex were her fault. No one asked if she invited cameras into her life. They just made a decision. Her jaw clenched as she read it twice, then folded her phone in her lap like it had just delivered the last blow she could take. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as tears finally broke loose. Hot, fast, and furious, she sobbed into her fists, shoulders shaking. Not for herself, but for everything she couldn't shield Miles from. For the permanent ache of watching her son be exceptional in a world that only saw him as expendable. For the nights he stayed up solving problems while she calculated which bill she could push into next month. For the phone calls she ignored because she didn't have answers. For the voice inside her that warned, every time he smiled, that the world would try to dim it. She hated that this fight had cost them so much. And she hated that she still had to pretend it hadn't. When the tears finally stopped, she wiped her face with a napkin from the glove compartment and looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were swollen, but sharp, tired, but unbroken. She adjusted her hair, retied her bun, and reapplied a thin coat of lipstick. By the time she walked through the front door that evening, she had become steel again. Miles was on the floor, hunched over practice problems, headphones in, papers surrounded him like a fortress. She stood in the doorway, taking him in, the rhythm in his shoulders, the scratch of his pencil, the fire that wouldn't die. He didn't see her cry. He never would. Instead, she crossed the room, leaned down, and kissed the top of his head. She told him she was proud. She told him that no matter what they tried to take, they could never measure what he carried inside him. He nodded without turning. He was focused. His competition was in 2 days. She didn't interrupt. That night, after Miles had gone to bed, Keandra stood in the kitchen, counting dollars in her palm, like they might multiply if she stared long enough. She had missed 2 rent payments, one in full, one partial. The landlord had called once, then sent a letter, then gone quiet, which she knew from experience was worse than the noise. Eviction wasn't a process. It was a pounce. Her bank account held less than $200. She had no backup job, no second car, and no family nearby to fall back on. The necklace she sold had bought Miles's laptop. Her last nice purse had gone toward groceries. Every resource she had left was already on his desk, in the form of ink and graphite. Still, she didn't regret it. Not 1 ounce. Because if the world wasn't going to make room for boys like Miles, then she would carve it open herself. But the cost was growing, and she had nothing left to pay with. The next morning, she stopped by the leasing office, early, hoping to plead quietly, respectfully, for one more extension. The receptionist smiled too widely, asked her to wait. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, the office manager appeared. She didn't invite Keandra to sit. She didn't offer her water. She just placed a file on the counter and slid it across like a verdict. Inside was a copy of their lease agreement, a record of missed payments, and a formal notice of intent to evict, dated, signed, sealed. Keandra didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She just closed the folder and walked out slowly, her heels clicking with precision down the tile floor. She cried again in her car. But this time, it was silent. Not broken, just tired. That evening, she made dinner from what little was left in the pantry: canned soup, day-old bread. Miles ate without complaint, thanked her afterward, and returned to his studying. She cleaned the dishes in silence. The television played low in the background. News coverage of the upcoming school math challenge. A brief mention of rising student genius, but no name given. No image. The erasure again was tactical. Then, just as she was drying her hands, the phone rang. Unknown number. She answered on instinct, expecting another late bill collector. Instead, it was her landlord. He didn't ask for pleasantries. He didn't ask about her son. He just said the words flatly, like reading from a script. The paperwork has been filed. The eviction is official. You'll need to be out within 10 business days. No pause. No emotion. Just another person washing their hands of her. She stood frozen at the sink, water dripping from her fingertips onto the floor. She didn't scream. She didn't reply. She just stared straight ahead, already trying to figure out where her son would sleep. As she hangs up the phone, she sees Miles's open math notebook on the table, with a line scribbled in unfamiliar handwriting across the last page. Not even numbers can save you now. The morning of the semi-final round felt like a courtroom. Miles woke early, not from nerves, but from the weight of everything left unsaid. The eviction, the threats, the silence behind every closed door at school. He moved quietly through the apartment, careful not to wake his mother. She hadn't slept much, and he could hear it in the way her breathing sounded through the bedroom wall, shallow, broken by sighs. The note in his math notebook, "Not even numbers can save you now," still echoed in the back of his mind, but he hadn't shown it to anyone. He had only stared at it, then flipped the page. The fear didn't stop him. If anything, it refined him. At school, the building felt different. Too polished. Too clean. Posters lined the front hallway. Round 2 witnessed the future of math. Glossy banners hung from the ceiling. A red carpet, absurdly out of place, stretched from the cafeteria to the auditorium doors. Everything screamed celebration, but the tension said otherwise. Inside the auditorium, rows of folding chairs had been placed in neat alignment. The stage was lit by harsh fluorescent lights. At the back, camera crews from the district's media team set up tripods. Microphones dangled over the judge's table. Students filed in slowly, buzzing with the kind of excitement that wasn't joy. It was curiosity mixed with suspicion. They hadn't come to cheer. They came to see if he would break. Teachers sat in the front row, arms folded, clipboards on laps. Principal Lovett stood near the curtains, flanked by 2 assistant principals, his smile stretched thin. To the side, a school board member with a TV smile and a practiced nod greeted parents with performative warmth. The board didn't care about the competition. They cared about coverage. Miles walked into that space like stepping into a trap he had already measured. He wore his oldest hoodie. Not defiance, comfort. He carried a folder with fresh scratch paper, sharpened pencils, and a blank face. His posture was steady, but inside his heart was racing, not from doubt but from restraint. Every eye was watching, every failure waiting to be exploited. Trevor stood off to the side, laughing with Derek. Brianna checked her nails, then glanced at Miles and whispered something under her breath. Whatever it was, it made the others smirk, but none of it reached Miles. He didn't care. They had trained for visibility. He had trained for precision. The round began with introductions. Each student stood as their name was called. Polite applause followed. When Miles's name echoed through the auditorium, there was a noticeable pause, a hitch in the clapping, like the audience didn't know what tone to take. Applauding too loudly would seem like support too soft, and it would expose bias. So instead they gave him the applause of politeness, thin and uncertain. The host, a regional math coach flown in for credibility, explained the rules. 1 final problem, 1 shot, a question designed to test logic, strategy, and structure. Each student would have 10 minutes. No calculators, no collaboration. The question appeared on the projection screen behind them. The moment the text appeared, the auditorium seemed to shrink. It was brutal. A logic puzzle disguised as a geometric function, one that required lateral thinking, knowledge of recursive sequences, and visual mapping all at once. It was the kind of question designed to humble students, not empower them, and it was clear who it had been aimed at. A trap wrapped in complexity. A puzzle meant to confuse, not test. The other students froze. Trevor blinked rapidly, his pen unmoving. Brianna flipped her scratch paper 3 times, then stared forward. Derek's pencil hovered in the air, scribbled one number, then scratched it out. Miles leaned in. He saw something they didn't. Not in the numbers, in the gaps. There was an intentional flaw in the question. A setup built to mislead. A part of the problem assumed a value without defining its origin. Most would plug in formulas, try to bend it to fit. But Miles saw it for what it was. A misdirection. His pencil began to move. He didn't calculate. He diagrammed. He mapped the shape not as a numeric function, but as a sequence of decisions. He realized the question wasn't about solving for X. It was about identifying the moment the structure failed, and proving why the failure itself held the key. The room held its breath. Even the judges leaned forward. One of the teachers whispered something to the principal. Miles flipped his paper, wrote the answer, then circled it once. He looked up, not for applause, but to measure how long it would take them to understand what he had done. The board member raised a brow. The host blinked twice. One of the cameras zoomed in. Then, silence. A minute passed. 2. The other students still scribbled, still guessing, still trying to force the puzzle to cooperate. But it wouldn't, because it was never meant to be solved the way they were solving it. As the timer ends, the host stares at Miles's paper, and his expression suddenly shifts from confusion to disbelief. For one long second, no one moved. Miles sat with his hands still, pencil placed neatly across the top of his paper. He wasn't trying to impress. He wasn't waiting for praise. He had simply done what the others hadn't, seen through the illusion. Across the stage, Trevor scribbled harder, frustration tightening his jaw. Brianna whispered something to herself and scratched out her last line again. Derek shook his head, erasing so violently that bits of rubber scattered like ash across his desk. The timer buzzed. 10 minutes gone. Just like that. The host stood slowly, clipboard in hand, eyes fixed on Miles's paper. His brow furrowed, lips parted slightly, as if caught mid-thought. Then he looked at the judges, and something passed between them. A flicker of surprise that tried to mask itself behind professionalism. But it was too late. The expression had escaped, and it rippled. A math teacher from a neighboring district leaned in, whispering sharply to another judge. The school board member narrowed her eyes, reading and rereading the solution on Miles's sheet. Then the host stepped to the microphone and cleared his throat. "We will be taking a short pause before announcing results," he said, voice carefully neutral. "Judges will confer privately." No applause, no movement, just a soft wave of murmurs sweeping through the auditorium. Miles stood and quietly returned to his seat. His face remained unreadable. His heart, however, pounded with quiet precision. He had mapped the entire structure in his mind, traced the flaw in the question, and rewritten the logic, not just to find the answer but to prove the foundation was wrong. He hadn't just solved the problem, he had deconstructed it, and now they didn't know what to do with that. Backstage, the judges gathered behind the curtain, voices tight and anxious. The district math coach, a middle-aged man with a reputation for conservative grading, questioned whether Miles had misunderstood the instructions. The others disagreed. His work was sound, his logic airtight. The issue wasn't clarity. It was brilliant, unapologetic brilliance, from a black boy they had tried to erase. Principal Lovett hovered nearby, phone in hand, eyes darting to the door as though hoping someone might interrupt with a reason to stop this from snowballing. In the auditorium, students waited. Whispers swelled, fingers tapped phones under chairs. A few recorded snippets, panning toward Miles with silent curiosity. The same kid they had laughed at for his accent now sat at the center of something too large to dismiss. Then, without ceremony, the judges returned. The host approached the mic again, his throat cleared. Again, there was a unique interpretation of the final problem, he began, one that challenged the framework of the original question. No names yet. No winner announced. Just carefully chosen words, as if the truth still needed softening. But upon review, the host continued, the logic used was not only valid, it revealed a flaw in the question itself, a flaw none of us had previously noticed. Now the room leaned forward. One teacher gasped softly. A few parents exchanged glances. Some of the students began to film, realizing something important was happening, even if they didn't understand it yet. The only competitor to fully identify and resolve that flaw, the host said, voice steady now, was Miles Trenholm. The name hit the air like a spark. No applause followed immediately. No cheer. just a sharp, collective intake of breath. It wasn't disbelief. It was recognition, the kind that comes too late, when the truth finally breaks through the ceiling. For a second, everything went still. Then, from the back of the auditorium, a slow clap began. One student, then two, then a few more. The sound built slowly, awkwardly, as if the crowd was relearning how to react to something they hadn't prepared for. Principal Lovett didn't clap. Miss Becker folded her arms. Trevor looked like he had been punched without warning. Brianna stared down at her shoes. But the truth was out now, and it filled the room. Miles didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He simply nodded once, then stood up to retrieve his paper when called. The host handed it to him with a strange, quiet respect. Not exaggerated, not forced, just real. For the first time, someone looked at Miles not as a student, to be tolerated, but a mind to be studied. Outside the building, the first van had already parked. The logo was unmistakable. WXGN Local News. A cameraman stepped out, holding a press badge, phone pressed to his ear. Another van pulled up behind. By the time the school's media rep noticed, 2 more outlets had been tagged in a viral repost. The competition footage was now circulating in real time, with one headline already forming. Black middle schooler outsmarts district judges on record. Inside, the administrators moved quickly. Staff were instructed to delay release of the full footage. Parents were told to leave through side exits. The celebration was quieted before it could grow. But the moment had already escaped them. Miles had rewritten the story, and they couldn't edit him out. 30 minutes later, Keandra opens the front door and finds 3 reporters waiting on her porch, with a copy of Miles's solution in their hands. The moment the judges announced Miles's victory, the school acted as if it had been preparing for the celebration all along. Within an hour, a congratulatory banner had been printed by the media team. A photo backdrop with the school logo was dragged out of storage. Teachers who hadn't spoken to Miles in weeks suddenly appeared at his sides, trying to edge into camera shots with practiced enthusiasm. They positioned themselves like proud mentors, tilting their bodies to seem supportive, smiling with the kind of brightness that only appeared when a lens was present. But beneath the performance, the cracks showed. Their smiles were stiff. Their movements were offbeat. They never placed a hand on his shoulder or leaned too close. Respect didn't guide them. Caution did. Every congratulation carried the same hollow note, as if they were checking a box. They praised his achievement but dodged every mention of what led to it. They framed the win as a triumph of school spirit, not resilience against racism. They highlighted his dedication, not the barriers they had built. The district sent out a press statement before lunch, a carefully worded announcement celebrating student talent and instructional excellence. It credited the school's academic environment, referred vaguely to community support, and thanked the faculty for guiding the next generation. Nowhere did it mention Miles's accent. Nowhere did it acknowledge the viral video. Nowhere did it address the climate that had made the challenge necessary in the first place. They tried to absolve themselves by absorbing his success. Miles watched the spectacle quietly, standing in front of a camera he didn't want, holding a certificate he didn't ask for. He didn't resist, but he didn't smile either. His stillness made some teachers visibly uneasy. They wanted gratitude, not truth. They wanted him to play the role they had assigned, the redeemed student, the shining example of opportunity, the proof that the system worked. But Miles had already seen too much. Trevor and the others stood off to the side, sour-faced. Their disappointment carried a bitter edge that wasn't born from losing to a peer. It came from losing to someone they had been taught to underestimate. Their shock wasn't about ability, it was about identity. Later that afternoon, the school posed for an official group photo. The principal insisted on standing behind Miles, close enough to seem invested, but far enough to avoid implying familiarity. When the camera flashed, his smile was tight, brows lifted in false pride. Once the shutter clicked, his face fell quickly, shoulders dropping into the stiffness he wore whenever something escaped his control. Teachers murmured to each other afterward, in the staff room. Some insisted the competition had been a fluke. Others speculated that Miles had received outside help. A few claimed the winning answer shouldn't have counted because it questioned the framing rather than solving it. The prejudice was no longer subtle. Victory had dragged it into the open like an exposed wire sparking in a flooded room. The school pretended to celebrate him, but outside the school walls, the tone shifted sharply. That evening, Keandra opened the front door to find 3 reporters waiting, each holding printed copies of Miles's winning solution. Their faces carried polite curiosity mixed with something else. Expectation. They wanted a story, the prodigy, the challenge, the triumph. They wanted her to the narrative they had crafted, the one that softened the blow of racism into a feel-good arc. She declined every interview. She closed the door gently, but the boundary collapsed quickly. Within hours, her inbox filled with messages from strangers, some encouraging, some invasive, some dripping with subtle contempt. People wanted answers she didn't owe them. They wanted access she refused to give. Then the threats began. The first arrived as a voicemail from an unknown number, a distorted voice warning her to keep the boy in line. Then a text message saying the family was making trouble. Then a comment on a neighborhood forum accusing her of teaching Miles to play the victim for attention. None of the messages named race directly, but every word carried the weight of long-buried hostility. The second threat was worse. A letter arrived in their mailbox, printed neatly, without return address. The envelope had no stamp. Someone had placed it there by hand. Inside, a single paragraph accused Miles of embarrassing the school, exaggerating the situation, and seeking sympathy instead of education. The final line warned that good families know when to stay quiet. Keandra read it twice before folding it sharply and sliding it into a kitchen drawer. She didn't show Miles. She wouldn't let him see the world reacting to his brilliance with fear. But he felt the shift anyway. He noticed the neighbors who once greeted them, now pulling their curtains closed. He noticed two older men talking in hushed tones near the complex entrance, glancing in his direction with expressions that did not carry curiosity, only judgment. He noticed the way cars slowed as they passed his building, drivers studying him through glass. And then, the unexpected twist. The school posted a photo of Miles on social media, celebrating him as a rising scholar. But they cropped the image. They cut out the judges, the other contestants, the context. The caption framed him as a product of school leadership, not a survivor of school negligence. People commented, shared, praised the district. The same district trying to evict his voice from the narrative. Keandra logged on, saw the post, and stared at it for several minutes. Not out of pride, out of the quiet, rising rage that comes from seeing your child used as decoration by the very people who harmed him. She turned off her phone without commenting. But the story wasn't done tightening its grip. 2 days later, a thin envelope appeared on their doorstep. No postage, no handwriting, just a printed label with their apartment number. She opened it cautiously, expecting another warning, another spiteful note, another faceless threat. It wasn't a letter. It was a printout, a screenshot. The eviction notice, the one she had hidden behind the calendar, copied, enlarged, and slipped through her front door. Someone in the building knew. Someone wanted her to know they knew. Someone wanted fear to spread quietly, privately, in the space where she thought she had control. She stood there for a long moment, paper trembling in her hand. She looked toward the living room where Miles was studying, unaware of the new storm brewing outside their door. Her jaw tightened. Her pulse quickened. This was no longer just about a school competition. This was an attack on their stability, their dignity, their right to exist without punishment for speaking truth. As she folds the screenshot, a knock echoes through the door, firm, deliberate, and too familiar to ignore. The knock at the door wasn't random. It was firm. 3 times. Not the anxious tap of a neighbor. Not the careless rhythm of a package delivery. This knock was deliberate, like someone claiming space that wasn't theirs to take. Keandra opened it with her spine already stiffened, her grip on the door frame tighter than she realized. On the other side stood a woman in a tailored blazer, holding a branded folder with the school district's seal stamped in gold foil. District Liaison. Keandra had seen her once before. At a community event, standing beside the superintendent, and nodding politely while someone else spoke about diversity achievements. She wasn't a teacher. She wasn't a parent. She was a buffer, sent to manage damage without addressing truth. She didn't ask to come inside. She didn't have to. She handed Keandra the folder and explained, with mechanical warmth, that the school board would soon issue a statement of resolution regarding the recent events. They were preparing a formal conclusion to the Redmond incident. No names would be listed, no wrongdoing admitted, but they would, she assured, review all findings internally. She didn't mention the eviction. She didn't ask about the threats. She just smiled, a soft, trained curve, and told Keandra that the district hoped Miles would participate in upcoming media outreach to help promote healing. The door shut before she could finish the sentence. Inside, Keandra opened the folder. It contained a pre-written quote, attributed to her, one she never approved, praising the school for supporting her son's potential and demonstrating leadership in crisis. They wanted her signature by Friday. She didn't sign. She burned it. But outside her small apartment, the world kept spinning. Something had broken open in the days following Miles's competition win. The silence that once blanketed the school community had torn at the seams. A former student, now in college, posted a thread about Miss Redmond's years-long record of racial microaggressions. Other alumni followed. Dozens of comments described the same pattern. Her tone with black students, her double standards in grading, her habit of correcting speech she didn't like. Then came the screenshots. Photos of class assignments with racial undertones. Group texts among students quoting her impersonations. An anonymous staff email leaked a list of prior parent complaints that had never been followed up on. A petition calling for Ms. Redmond's removal passed 20,000 signatures in 4 days. Students staged a walkout, holding signs that read, "We're not your teachable moment," and Miles was the spark, we're the fire. A local activist group organized a community forum, inviting educators, parents, and legal experts to discuss systemic bias in public schools. The gymnasium overflowed. But still, Ms. Redmond remained. The district placed her on leave, but made no public comment. Her name vanished from the faculty page. Her classroom stayed locked. Her presence became ghost-like, no longer visible, but still shaping the room. Miles didn't speak during any of the protests. He didn't give interviews. He didn't show up for the photo ops arranged by the district after they saw the backlash building. He stayed at his desk studying, drawing out new problem sets, scribbling equations as the noise outside swelled into something louder than any teacher's lesson. He received 2 letters that week. One was from Harvard, the other from Princeton. Both were invitations for early interviews. Rare for someone his age. The letters praised his performance, his intellect, his ability to challenge frameworks. They hinted at future scholarships. They asked if he could meet with faculty via Zoom to discuss academic alignment. He read both letters in silence, then tucked them into a drawer, not because he wasn't proud, but because he wasn't ready to celebrate something that hadn't changed anything yet. The school tried again, this time offering to name a new math award after him. They wanted to call it the Trenholm Achievement Scholarship. They drafted press releases, designed logos, and emailed Keandra for a statement. Miles declined. He didn't want a plaque. He wanted the truth on paper, not a new award, a new precedent. Meanwhile, the threats escalated. A second letter arrived in their mailbox, this time with no words, just a photo of their apartment door, taken from outside the building. A shadow was visible in the corner of the image. It wasn't random. It was intentional. It was surveillance disguised as silence. Keandra filed a police report. Nothing came of it. Miles stayed alert, but he didn't flinch. His presence at school became quieter, heavier. He answered only when necessary. He studied harder than before. His teachers couldn't decide how to treat him. Some tried kindness. Others gave him space. A few still looked at him like a storm they hadn't prepared for. He wasn't unpredictable. He was just unstoppable. Then the district sent out an internal email. Not to parents, not to students, but to staff. The subject line, "Board to discuss Redmond's situation in closed-door session Thursday." That was all. No agenda. No public input. No transparency. They wanted to end it behind the curtain. Control the story. Control the terms. Control the fallout. When the email leaked, and it did, the outrage reignited. More signatures poured into the petition. Parents flooded the board's inbox. Local news stations picked up the story again, this time questioning the district's refusal to hold open meetings. One headline read, "Closed-door cover-up. School board shuts public out of racial inquiry." Still, the board said nothing. But Keandra knew what silence meant in politics. It wasn't confusion. It was choreography. That night she sat with Miles, at the kitchen table. She didn't bring up the board, didn't mention the vote, didn't share the reporter's email, asking for a joint interview. She simply sat across from her son, the boy they had tried to shame, erase, weaponize, and watched him write formulas with calm certainty. Every answer he solved pushed back against a structure designed to collapse under his success. And he hadn't flinched once. He didn't need the system to see him. He needed it to change. The next morning, a district employee leaks the board's confidential notes, revealing that Miss Redmond had not only remained on payroll, She had just been reassigned to train new teachers. The auditorium was packed. Rows of folding chairs stretched back to the walls. Parents sat shoulder to shoulder with teachers, community leaders, and students from other districts. The lights had been lowered. The sound system tested twice. A red rug covered the stage floor, small but intentional, centered beneath a banner that read, "Voices that redefine the future." This wasn't a school function. It was a TEDx youth event, hosted by a local college and live-streamed across public networks. And at the center of it all stood a boy the system tried to silence, now holding the mic they never wanted him to have. Miles didn't wear a suit. He wore a hoodie, the same one he wore the day he wrote the winning answer. The sleeves were too short now. The fabric stretched across his growing frame. But he didn't care. He wasn't there to impress. He was there to remind. The host gave a brief introduction. Just the facts. No embellishment. Then stepped aside, and Miles stepped forward. He stood still for a moment, eyes scanning the crowd. His heart beat hard, but steady, like it had learned rhythm through resistance. He cleared his throat once, adjusted the mic, and his voice filled the room. Unapologetic, unfiltered, southern. It carried every curve of the region they tried to erase from him. Every vowel they'd once called lazy. Every intonation they'd said sounded uneducated. Every sound that had made Ms. Redmond laugh. Now no one was laughing. He spoke of language, not grammar, but power. Of how the way you speak becomes the way you're heard. Of how systems aren't just built on rules, but on tones, judgments, and expectations buried inside standard speech. He told the story of the math problem. Not the win. The silence. The sabotage. The isolation that comes when you dare to succeed in a space that only tolerates you when you're invisible. He shared the words written in his notebook. The ones no teacher ever asked to read. The data he collected. The subtle ways black students were erased, without being marked absent. He told them about the night he discovered the eviction notice. How his mother kept pushing, kept smiling, kept feeding him answers she didn't have. He told them about the notes, the threats, the red ink riddles, the photo on the doorstep. And then he paused. He looked straight at the front row, where a few of the same educators who had once ignored him now sat with folded hands and tightened jaws. He didn't name them. He didn't need to. He simply said, "They tried to fix my voice like it was broken, but it wasn't. It was just unfamiliar." To them, the room went silent, not from shock, from recognition. Then he shifted. He began connecting math to speech, equations to identity. He showed how patterns in language reveal bias, the same way formulas reveal errors. He spoke not like a boy giving a speech, but like a teacher, a scientist, a witness. And when he ended after 17 minutes of storytelling, logic and quiet fire, the room exploded. Not a single camera remained off. Not a single teacher looked away. He stepped off stage without bowing, without raising a fist, without blinking. Later that night, Keandra found him on the apartment balcony. Their rent now paid, their eviction dismissed after national attention had made silence too costly for the landlord. She watched him sit with his feet up, eating cereal from the box, scrolling his phone like nothing had changed. But everything had, and he still hadn't smiled. Not fully, because the fight had given him more than visibility. It had given him clarity. That same evening, as he plugged in his laptop to begin reviewing advanced calculus videos, a notification popped up in the corner of the screen. Subject line, Curriculum Licensing Approval, Miles Trenholm. It was from an education nonprofit. National. Respected. The message was brief. They wanted permission to include his TEDx talk and his story in their nationwide curriculum on anti-racist pedagogy. For middle school classrooms, for high school professional development, for teachers, for textbooks. His voice, the one they once laughed at, was about to become required reading. As he reads the email again, a second one arrives, this time from a university in New York, offering him a paid summer fellowship to co-develop an AI-based program that detects bias in classroom language. Some stories fade when the headlines disappear. But stories like Miles's shouldn't fade. They should change something in us. If you believe no child should be mocked for the way they speak, if you believe brilliance should never be silenced by bias, type yes if you believe in justice and subscribe if this broke your heart.